All right, in this video, we're going to look at the tissues or histology and skin. So in the human body, we have four main types of tissues. Your epithelial tissue is going to cover surfaces. It's also going to make up glands and tubes. So this picture here to the right is an example of some epithelial tissue making up some tubes. You can see that there is a hollow space in the center with the cells around the tubes. The next type is connective tissue. This is going to help to support and bind tissues together. It's also our energy reserves, our immunity. This is a really diverse type of tissue. In this example here, we have some adipose tissue, which is fat tissue, is an example of connective tissue. Next is the muscular tissue. So this is used for movement. This is an example of some muscle tissue here. And then nervous tissue. We use this for communication and coordinating activities. Here's an example of a nerve cell within some nerve tissue. In this section, we're going to focus mostly on the epithelial and connective tissues because we cover the muscle and nervous tissue in their own separate sections later on. So with the epithelial tissue, some characteristics of it is it will be found in closely packed sheets, and it will either be single or multiple layers. It will tend to make up apical surfaces or basal membranes. What that means is it will be an edge surface. It's avascular, meaning it does not have a blood supply, but it does have a nerve supply to it. One of the characteristics of this tissue is it does have a high rate of cell division. Consequently, as a rate of having high rates of cell division, this is going to be the tissue that you're most frequently going to see cancers in. So looking at our types of epithelial tissue, the first is the squamous epithelium. These are flat cells. They're kind of an irregular shape. They're good for the rapid passage of substances. You would have some of these lining your cheeks. So when you look at cheek cells in the lab, you're able to see what this cell type looks like in the squamous epithelium. Cuboidal epithelium is going to have cells that are a little bit more square in shape. They're good for secretion and absorption. When we say square in shape, it does mean approximately equal height and width. They're not going to look exactly like cubes or squares. The columnar epithelium are taller. They're going to offer a little bit more protection. They're also going to be good for secretion and absorption. And these may have villi or cilia on the surface. In the transitional epithelium, these have the ability to change shape. So they'll range from being cuboidal to flat. This gives them some stretch. The classic example of where you find this is in the bladder. So simple epithelium refers to just a single layer. Being a single layer makes it good for diffusion and osmosis, as well as filtration. It's good for secretion and absorption because it doesn't have a lot of material it has to go through. Some examples, simple squamous tissue, we would have this lining the heart, the alveoli and the lungs, and the blood vessels. Simple columnar cells and some of the cuboidal cells, you would see these places like the ovaries, the secretory parts of glands, like the thyroid. When the cells are ciliated, this is going to be good for moving mucus and particles. So our ciliated simple columnar epithelium, these are found in the trachea, the upper respiratory tract. The cilia are going to be good for moving mucus up the respiratory tract to try and keep it out of the lungs. When we have stratified epithelium, this is going to be 2 or more layers. This will be more helpful for protecting underlying tissue and the skin from heat. If you've ever had a blister that you've peeled off, or several layers of skin that have been peeled off, and you go to put your hand in a water temperature that's normal, you go, okay, this is my normal water temperature, and then you put that part of the skin in that's had several layers peeled off, you realize that it really is good at insulating the tissues underneath from heat. You'll feel that the water is extra hot in that particular location because you don't have that protection. Keratinization is going to be when the tissues have more keratin protein in them. It's a hard protein that's going to help to protect it from heat and microbes and various chemicals. So this is common to see in the skin. Glandular epithelium is more specialized epithelium. Glands are just going to secrete substances. So 2 major kinds of glands we have. Endocrine glands are going to secrete hormones that will go into the interstitial fluids and they will diffuse throughout the body. So they'll have their effects in other places. This would be things like the pituitary, the adrenal glands, the thyroid glands. Exocrine glands, on the other hand, are going to secrete their products into ducts. These will make things like mucus, perspiration, milk, saliva, digestive enzymes. These you don't want to have throughout your body. They're just in limited areas. With connective tissue, one of the things they all have in common is a matrix, which is material between the cells. Part of what's going to make up connective tissue is having a ground substance. This is made up of water, various polysaccharides, and proteins. Some of them will have hyaluronic acid in there, which is a viscous, slippery substance. To get an idea what this feels like, if you think about the slippery part on the end of a chicken bone, that cartilage is high in hyaluronic acid, and that's what makes it slippery. These are some examples of cells. This is not an exhaustive list. One of them are the fibroblasts. So a cell that's a blast is going to be a cell that secretes or builds something. These cells secrete fibers. These are used for strength and support. Macrophages, they're one of the white blood cells. They're going to do phagocytosis of bacteria and debris. Mast cells, these live near the blood vessels. They like to produce histamine and help with the immune response. Adipocytes, they're fat cells. So those are just a few examples. Some of the fibers we have, collagen fibers, these are very strong fibers. They're 25% of the protein in the body and found in most connective tissues. Vitamin C is required to make collagen fibers. When a person has a vitamin C deficiency or scurvy, what you'll tend to see with that is easy bruising and pinpoint bleeding because they don't have good collagen fibers to make strong vessels. They also will have a tendency to lose their teeth. So MSM is a nutrient that provides a source of sulfur that can be helpful for people with musculoskeletal injuries. It's not something that a person who has sulfur sensitivities would want to take. However, for most people it is relatively safe and helps in rebuilding those collagen fibers. Elastic fibers are smaller, but they have the ability to stretch to 1.5 times their length and then return back to the normal size. This is due to the protein elastin. So this stretching to 1.5 times their length and returning back to their normal size happens when they're young and healthy. As they get older, they do wear out, and things don't stretch and return back to the same place they were. So this is one of the reasons why our skin starts to sag as we get older. Reticular fibers, these are in the support walls of vessels. They help make up organ framework. They're thin fibers that help to support the basement membrane that other things are going to be built upon. So looking at our types of connective tissues here, the loose connective tissues have a looser arrangement. The areolar tissues, these are located in the subcutaneous and below the mucous membranes. They're around blood vessels. They help to keep things in place. They're not firmly anchored there. It allows them to move around a little bit, but it keeps them in the general vicinity they're supposed to be. Adipose tissue is our fat. It's used for triglyceride storage. With these cells, if you fill them up, what they will do is just simply divide in two, and now you have 2 cells to fill up. Generally, when a person loses weight, they're going to have the fat cells shrink, not necessarily be reduced in number. When we talk about cellulite, that is just fat that is underneath the skin, and what gives it the dimpled appearance is some of those areolar fibers will poke down into the adipose tissue to give it more of a quilted or cushioned appearance in there. Reticular connective tissue, that's going to bind smooth muscle. You'll find this places like the liver, the spleen, the lymph nodes, helps to give them some structure and maintain their shape. Dense regular connective tissues are going to have a denser arrangement in them. So the dense regular we would find in places like tendons, ligaments, aponeuroses, which are big, broad, flat tendons, things that make up attachments. So that's going to make these nice and strong. Their fibers are going to run very nice and neatly together. The dense irregular, the fibers are not quite as neatly arranged. They're still very strong, just not quite as strong as the dense regular. This would be things like the fascia, the deep dermis of the skin, the periosteum, which if you imagine eating ribs, sometimes you'll notice when you go to get the last little bit of meat off, it seems like there's a skin around the bone. That's periosteum. It will also make up joint and organ capsules. So this is pretty strong stuff. Leather is actually made from skin, and what gives it the strong properties is the dense irregular connective tissue. Elastic connective tissues, these will be places like the lungs, arteries, bronchioles, vocal cords, the ligaments between the vertebrae. Most ligaments are not elastic connective tissue, but the ones between the vertebrae are. This is going to help support the spine in the upright position without it relying quite as heavily on muscles. When we look at types of cartilage, the hyaline cartilage is the slippery stuff you see on the ends of long bones. You're also going to have this in your ribs, down in the front. You're going to have some in your nose, the larynx, and the trachea. Fibrocartilage, this has a greater number of fibers in it. You're going to have this in places like the pubic symphysis, the IVD or intervertebral disc in the spine, and the meniscus in the knee. Your elastic cartilage is going to be more stretchy, things that need to bend more. Places like the ears, the epiglottis in the throat, and the eustachian tubes. So with your ears, they can actually become almost a little droopy on top as that elastic cartilage wears out. For bone, we have a whole separate section on bone, so we just touch on it here. Two main varieties, compact or spongy bone. It's going to help to provide support and protection. It's the site of red blood cell production. Blood is a connective tissue as well. The plasma is the liquid matrix that you're going to have the cells suspended in. It's going to be made up of water, nutrients, and various enzymes. So the red blood cells are the ones that are going to be responsible for oxygen transport. They will also transport waste and some hormones. The white blood cells are the ones that are going to be involved with immunity. Your platelets, these are the ones involved with clotting or coagulation. Lymph is another connective tissue that's also going to travel in vessels, but it has less protein than the plasma does. So for muscle, we have three main types. Skeletal muscle is going to attach to bones. It's striated in nature, which means that it has a striped appearance, and it's under voluntary control. So you have conscious awareness and control of its contraction. Cardiac muscle is found in the heart. What makes this unique is it has these intercalated discs, which will allow the contractions to be synchronized. It's under involuntary control. So your heart is going to continue to beat whether you remember to have that happen or not. It's also striated in appearance. And then the smooth muscle is non-striated, and it's under involuntary control. This would be in the hollow organ walls, places like the stomach or the uterus. So nervous tissue, it's sensitive to stimuli. It's able to conduct nerve impulses. The neurons are the actual cells that do the impulse conduction, while the neuroglia are support cells. They don't actually do any conduction. So our membranes are pliable covers. A mucous membrane is one that's going to line a cavity open to the exterior, whereas serous membrane is going to line a closed cavity. So these mucous membranes, we do want them to be somewhat sticky. The idea is that that will help to trap particles, and we can control and prevent them from going further into the body when they're trapped. Some examples of serous cavities would be the pleura lining the lung cavity and the pericardium lining the heart cavity. Another type of cavity is a synovial cavity that we see in the synovial joints. This is also going to be very slippery because these joints move around a lot and you want to reduce friction. So an example of something that can go wrong with tissues would be SLE or systemic lupus erythematosus. It is an autoimmune condition, so it is the body attacking its own tissues that causes the problem. There is no cure for autoimmune conditions, so they just have to be managed. Most autoimmune conditions do occur with a greater frequency in females than in males. And part of this is due to chemicals that you have in the uterus that allow a fetus to be able to survive and not be attacked by the immune system. So an example of something you would see with some cases of lupus is this malar rash or a butterfly rash, where it's in kind of an imprint in a butterfly over her face, where the immune system is attacking underneath the skin. Another thing that can go wrong with tissues is having scar tissue or adhesions. Normally the tissues should be sliding past each other. Here it starts to adhere to neighboring tissues. And then when it moves around, it's going to pull on it and be very painful. So here's an illustration showing it, and this is a picture of an ovary adhering to the neighboring tissue when it should not. So the integumentary system is the skin. And I like this picture of the skin because it's not real cluttered up. It's nice and simple here, showing the different essential parts of the skin. There's three main regions to it: the epidermis, the dermis, and here you have the subcutaneous, which is also known as the hypodermis. So the epidermis is the superficial thin layer. The dermis is deeper. It's going to have more connective tissue. And then hypodermis is not actually part of the skin. It is in the subcutaneous. Here you're going to have areolar and adipose tissue. So we have four main types of cells in the epidermis. The keratinocytes are going to be the most abundant of these cells. They're 90% of them. They're going to produce keratin that's going to act as a water repellent and a sealant for the skin. The melanocytes are going to produce the pigment melanin. They're only about 8% of cells, regardless of what color your skin is. Some people just have more active melanocytes and the melanin is closer to the surface. Melanin is important because it will help to absorb the UV light. The Langerhans cells are immune cells. They're damaged by UV light. So darker skin does have a little bit more protection of UV light, although regardless of skin color, it is able to burn from UV light. And then we have Merkel cells that are used for tactile sensation, which is touch. So our epidermal layers are going to slowly be pushed to the surface as they grow. The deepest layer is the stratum basale. This is made up of cuboidal and columnar cells. Most of them are keratinocytes. They're in a single layer. Some of them are stem cells. This way you can continually produce more keratinocytes. So these will produce more cells that will get pushed up to the surface. Just above them is the stratum spinosum. It's an 8 to 10 layer of keratinocytes that are close together. These are named by their appearance underneath the microscope. This has more of a spiny appearance. Just above there you have the stratum granulosum. It's called that because of its granular appearance under the microscope. It's an additional 3 to 5 layers of keratinocytes. Here they're in apoptosis. It's a pre-programmed cell death. They are supposed to die at this point. So even though the cell is dead, the keratin is still present to help decrease the water loss with the dead cells. So the cells that you're feeling on the surface of your skin are all dead already anyway. The stratum lucidum, this is most abundant in the thick skins of the palms, the soles of the feet, the finger and toe pads. It's an additional 3 to 5 layers of flat dead keratinocytes in the keratin. It's going to offer additional protection in those areas that have more wear. The most superficial layer is the stratum corneum. It's an additional 25 to 30 layers. These are continually shed off. So over time, it does make up the majority of your pillow, your mattress, your stratum corneum from you, your family, your pets. They make up the majority of the house dust. So it's not necessarily a real pleasant thought. There are things you can get to try and reduce the amount of this that ends up in your pillows and mattress because dust mites will like it and it is a common source of allergies. Here, the interior of the cell is mostly keratin. Callus formation is when you have a lot of friction in the area, so you'll just increase the number of layers. So generally, if you're taking notes in this class, by the end of the quarter, if you don't have a callus on your finger now, you likely will. So the dermis is going to be deep to the epidermis. Here you're going to have collagen and elastic fibers. It's about 1/3 of the total thickness of the skin. In this picture here, you can see there's little ridges in here, the papillae, which will be little finger-like projections. They're going to contain arteries, veins, and nerves. Meissner's corpuscles and the free nerve endings will be in here. Meissner's corpuscles are used for touch. And then the free nerve endings, we can use these for warm and cool sensations, pain, itch, tickle. If you get an abrasion, what it will do is just kind of slice off this area. But the nerve endings are still there, and that's why abrasions are so sensitive, is now all those nerve endings are exposed to the air. Where if you have something where you fall and you skin your knee and you remove a significant portion of the skin, that's going to have bruising around it, but the skin itself is not going to be as sensitive because you've removed those layers. As they grow back and you have really thin skin covering those layers, it will go through a time period where it's really sensitive. So then we have accessories to the skin. Most of them are made up of dead keratinized cells. Hair is going to be on most surfaces except the palms and the soles. That is not a normal place to find hair. The follicle is the sheath around the hair, and it's going to have nerves in there. So when your hair gets moved, something grazes your arm, you'll actually feel it because of the nerve endings perceiving the movement of the hair. The shaft is the superficial part of the hair, and the root is in the epidermis. So a lot of times people think that when you shave a hair that it's going to make it grow back thicker. It does not. What it's doing is it's going to cause a blunt end to be cut here at the surface of the skin where the hair is thicker. When the hair just naturally grows out, it's going to be softer because it's going to be thin and tapered at the end. But it does not create more hair growth. The erector pili muscle, which you can see right here in this picture, is going to be smooth muscle that's going to go from the dermis to the follicle. When you're cold, what this will do is cause goosebumps. It causes the hair to be lifted up from the skin a little bit, and that area underneath the hair is a little air barrier that can be warmed. As humans, for the most part, we don't have enough body hair for that to really be a significant source of warmth. But if you look at birds, what they will do a lot of times, they will fluff up their feathers in there and allow that air to warm up. That's the reason why we use down is an insulating agent, is it allows that fluffed up air to heat up in that space. So here we have the cycle of hair growth. So the anagen phase is the active growing phase. So this picture is going to be for head hair, where that would last 2 to 6 years. Here your hair has a blood supply to it, it's actively growing, and it will continue to get longer during that time period. For body hair, it's going to be more on the lines of 3 to 6 weeks, and that's why the hair on your arms and legs does not get as long as the hair on your head. The catagen phase here is 1 to 2 weeks. Here the hair is beginning to die, so you get this club hair here. Then we have the telogen phase, that is the resting phase. This will last 5 to 6 weeks. You do have another hair that's going to come up and help to push this out. And then you have that new hair growing again, and it will return to the anagen phase. Only about 20% of your body hair is in the anagen phase at any given time. The significance in that is a lot of permanent hair reduction techniques are going to target hairs in the anagen phase. So it will take multiple treatments to get all of the hair. And they do refer to it as hair reduction rather than permanent hair removal because sometimes they do come back and it is very difficult to actually get all of them in there. If you're pulling hairs out with tweezers, sometimes you'll notice that there are some hairs that just pull out real easily and others that feel like they're anchored in there really good. That's really just a case of them being in different stages of growth. An anagen hair is going to require quite a bit of yanking to get out, where one that's in the telogen phase is going to come out pretty easily. Most of the time when waxing is done, it's usually done in about a 3-week cycle because you're trying to coordinate and get as many of the hairs in the anagen phase as you can. If you're removing hairs that are in the telogen phase, it's not long before another hair is going to come up. Alopecia is hair loss. Androgenic alopecia is the male pattern baldness of hair loss. This is on the X chromosome. We call it male pattern baldness. It can occur in females. It's just a lot less common because it is on the X chromosome and a female gets two of them. A female can have a more varied pattern of this as well. We have some glands in the skin. Sebaceous glands are going to produce an oil called sebum. Most of these are connected to hair follicles. The sebum helps to protect the skin, but you do want to have the sebum be able to move out of that gland. If it becomes blocked, it can form a blackhead. It can become inflamed to form a pimple, or infected and form a boil. Sudoriferous glands are an eccrine gland. These are going to produce sweat for temperature regulation. They're in the deep dermis of the skin. This type of sweat is largely water. It's going to have some ions, urea, uric acid, ammonia, glucose, lactose, and amino acids. As this evaporates from the skin, it's going to take some of the energy and heat with it, allowing the skin that's left behind to be cooled. So if you are in humid conditions, it doesn't evaporate very well, and that's what makes it harder to regulate body temperature and humidity. The apocrine glands, these are going to produce their secretions in response to stress and sexual excitement. They're located in the axillary and groin region, so they're subcutaneous. They'll open to the hair follicle. This type of sweat has more fat and protein than eccrine sweat. There is also more bacteria in that area, making it moister. This type of sweat is much more likely to smell, and it's going to be released during times when you are least likely to want to smell bad. Ceruminous glands, they produce earwax, and earwax is a sticky barrier to foreign matter. So as a kid, a lot of times little kids will try earwax and realize it doesn't taste very well. That's a good thing, because a human ear would actually be a really inviting place to an insect to go in. It's dry, it's warm, dead skin to eat, sheltered from the environment. So earwax is going to make it a less inviting place. If they go in, there is also more of the potential to stick in the wax. So occasionally they will walk in, their legs get caught, and the wings will still go, and the person will hear the vibrating from the wings. They can go in and have it flushed out. The skin from the ear is going to grow from medial to lateral, so it will eventually get hauled out anyway. So the ears are almost kind of self-cleaning in that way. So nails, these are on the ends of the fingers and toes. They're made up of tightly packed keratin. They offer protection. So if you've broken a fingernail down too far, you know how sensitive the skin can be there when it's all of a sudden exposed. So functions of our skin, it's temperature regulation. It's going to provide protection. It's that barrier to the outside world. Cutaneous sensation. It's going to allow for excretion and absorption, and the first step in vitamin D synthesis. So some things that can go wrong with the skin. We have skin cancers. Basal cell carcinoma is 78% of them. It's in the stratum basale of the epidermis. Metastasis this is rare, but it doesn't mean you don't treat it. It just gives us a better opportunity to be able to successfully treat this. This does not necessarily look like what you would stereotypically imagine skin cancer to look like. This can look like some type of sore that just doesn't heal up. Malignant melanoma, this is the worst type, but it's fortunately only 2%. It involves the melanocytes, directly the result of sun damage. This is the one where you're going to have the mole that's changed shape, changed texture, size, elevation, any of those kinds of changes that will go with it. And then squamous cell carcinoma, it's about 20% of skin cancers. It involves the squamous cells of the epidermis. It's got a more variable metastatic tendency. This occurs 50% more in males than females. We don't know exactly why. Males are more likely to have an occupation that is outside than a female is. Males also have a thicker epidermis than females as well. And this is not going to have the characteristic appearance of a skin cancer. So there is a website, dermatlas.com, that you can go on that has thousands, literally, of images of different skin conditions that you can look at. And it can be helpful to look at some of the skin cancers to get an idea of them. Generally, for them to be fully diagnosed, they do have to be biopsied and looked at underneath the microscope. But somebody who is trained in viewing them can know which ones actually need to be biopsied and which ones don't necessarily need to be biopsied and removed. So when we look at burns, so first-degree burns are the most superficial. That's going to be this top picture here. They're usually characterized by some redness. They may peel. These can be things similar to a sunburn. So it can happen from UV light. It can happen from heat. It can happen from radiation or from chemicals. Second-degree burns, they may be red, but they'll have blistering because it's going to involve damage going deeper into the skin, and the skin's no longer able to keep all of that fluid in. So what causes the blisters is some of the interstitial fluid starting to seep up through the skin. And again, it's all of those same things that can cause these burns. Third-degree burns can have the same causes as well. They're more severe. You actually have skin death and loss of sensation in that area. So that's this bottom picture down here. You can actually have sunlight cause third-degree burns that will bleed and kill the skin in those areas. So with these, while they may lose sensation in that area, it does not mean it's not painful. The areas around it are going to be really sensitive. It's going to be very sensitive as it starts to heal. And they frequently need to debride the dead tissue off, which is not a pleasant experience either. So one of the reasons for needing to remove that dead tissue is it's an open invitation for infections to occur. So when we look at burns, the severity is not only the percentage of the body that's burned, but the location. If it's burned around mucous membranes, that's generally going to be considered more severe. So water loss is also a problem. There's a lot of water that actually will evaporate through the area where the skin was without the skin being there to protect it. So if you are interested in the skin, I would definitely take a look at that Dermatology Atlas website. There's a couple different ones, the Derm Atlas and then the meddine.luc.edu, that have a huge number of images on there that can be very graphic if you're into that thing.